What's up? Welcome back. This is Siris King, and I'm going to continue my monad series, right? I'm going to continue my series on Gnosticism, and today I'm going to talk about the concept of the monad. So, the monad is interesting because it's basically, if you just look at it in its pure form, a circle and a dot in the middle of the circle, right? And in let me just go within random occultism first, right? The circle is a powerful object, right? Or image, or it's not really a number, but let's say it's a number for now, right? And so the occultists came first, Gnostic came second. So in Gnosticism, they then took that and said that's what God is, right? God animates from that, the true God, right? And this is what, in my opinion, what separates Gnostics from Christians, and this is what separates Gnostics from the pagan faiths. In that, in Gnosticism, and again, like I said in other videos, there's a lot of variation in Gnosticism. There's many, the end goal is the same, but many Gnostics start on different paths. So when you start on different paths, there are going to be differences until you get to the end goal, right? But for the most part, especially when you talk about the type of Gnosticism I'm kicking on this page, this is the monad is what separates the Gnostics from the Christians and the pagans. Why do I say that? Well, the Christians, okay, because understand what the monad is, right? It's God, right? And then it gives birth to numbers, and then numbers give birth to points, lines, etc., right? Which would then form the physical world, which would then form the elements. You know, you're going to get into Sophia and Demerge. I'm going to talk about them separately, right? That leads into all that. So in a sense, what happens is, how would that make so let's start with a Gnostic versus the traditional Christian, right? How would that understanding make a Gnostic differ than the traditional Christian? Well, if you think about it, it's sort of simple in a sense, right? Because the traditional Christian would say, well, first of all, wouldn't even get into concepts like numbers and circles and any of that. They would just say God, right? And which is fine. But when a Gnostic is doing it, they put in not only giving it a mathematical origin, in a sense, but they're also telling you why science wouldn't be able to understand God. They can't calculate it. Science traditionally can only calculate things from 1 or 2 on, really 2, but from 1 on, right? It can calculate 1, but from the number 2, they're more comfortable with it because they can compare it. There's a comparison. So that's what they talk about, evidence, right? So science starts at 2, even though the best of them can get to 1, but God is at 0, right? And not only is God at 0, what is the monad? It's a circle, right, which is 0, but there's a dot in it. So the person who's practicing, let's say you're the dot and you're in the circle, you have to be transformed to even understand what I'm talking about. So so then science would have obstacles to get to that point, because it would have to be a scientist who's also an occultist, right? So when you deal with Christians, they haven't, like the traditional Christians, because Gnostics are Christians too, but the traditional Christians, they haven't done the necessary inner work to start to basically enter the circle, right, or to even perceive what it is. So they're always going to be starting from probably the number 2 down, right? And that's if they're steady with their faith. Most people are starting, because the circle gives birth to numbers, then lines, then points, then the elements. When you start getting into Merge, Sophia, it gets into a lot of different things. So the concept of the monad is, the further you get away from that, the more imperfect the creation is. And the problem when you hear that, human beings are very biased. So when I say the more imperfect the creation is, people will look at that and say bad, or people will look at it and judge. And that's not necessarily what you're supposed to do, right? And this is why we have different lines and different paths in Gnosticism, in that sense, because the in essence, what we're calling more imperfect is closer to our physical existence. So sometimes the imperfect forces are easier to access. Now that doesn't mean you're supposed to. Some of them you can. Some of them you should wait until you're transformed, in my opinion, right? But let's say, for instance, you have imperfect substances like the elements, right? The 4 elements, or you want to even say 5 elements. If you don't access the 4 or 5 elements, you can get into God, Sophia, the eons, Palermo. You can get into anything you want to, right? Into abstract thought, into any type of divinity that you think or that you perceive, right? And in essence, it wouldn't matter, because the elements, being where our physical bodies are made up of the elements, and it also affects our psychology, will block you. Like, you're not going to be able to perceive those abstract forces if you're elementally imbalanced. And I think, and that's why I'm going to go one step further, not in this video, but in general, of when I go through Gnosticism, I'm going to then go through Christian magic. Because Gnosticism is not magic. It's a philosophy. It's trying to achieve inner gnosis. So to me, it's a start. But to get to the true goal, you will have to implement that with Christian magic. That's why I see people telling me, read this book. And the books are fine. But in magic, it's an applied science. You're not going to get it if you don't actually apply it, right? And so when you deal with the monad, the concept is fascinating, because, like, I'm going into the Christians, but let's go with the pagans, right? Or the indigenous faiths. Most of them will start at the lesser forces, right? Again, when I say lesser forces, I just mean the forces that are furthest away from the monad, which is all the way up, right? And because they start there, and because we're in the physical world, the forces that they deal with can be perceived as older than the monad. Do you understand that? Because the monad, let's just say, it's at a higher point, right, in space, which is such a high. Think of the monad as such a higher point in space that only the mind can enter that, or really refined energy, right? And because of that, when you're going from the lower forms, when we're in from mineral to plant to animal to human, right? Look at that start. We won't perceive that until we get to a certain point, not just at the human stage, but at a certain point in the human stage. So when you're coming from the indigenous mindset, the forces that they deal with from their angle in their minds, can be perceived as being older than the monad itself. And again, this is where we all differ in Gnosticism and the various Gnostic circles, because when you come in more from the European Gnostic circles, they will perceive not only the indigenous forces as lesser, they would probably say you don't have to deal with that at all, or they'll look down on that, right? Like I said, a lot of the lesser forces in Gnosticism, when you're talking about the lesser forces, are the planets themselves, right? Are the elements, and are all the different spirits in between. And so for me, you can say lesser forces, but I'd rather just say the forces furthest from the monad, that some people could classify as imperfect. But those forces, traditionally, it's very hard to get to the level that people want to, right, without those forces. The problem comes in is that you just have to organize those forces. That's where African Gnosticism is very different than European Gnosticism. I'm an African Gnostic. That's the difference, right? The difference will be, from our perception, those forces that are furthest from the monad are just as important. The reason why, but they're personal. So they can cause havoc if you don't know how to organize them. That's the difference. Where the Europeans would come in, and again, I'm not even getting into white, black. I'm just saying the origin of various Gnostic thought, right? The European Gnostics would dismiss that completely. And what would happen is they would then achieve a state where they can intellectually, I guess, spit information, regurgitate information, but they can't really apply it. So then that's why when some people, like if you were to go to East, and some people deal with energy, and they just hear a Gnostic, and they look at them, the Gnostic doesn't really have the energy animating from them, because they're all intellect. So it's like when in Asia, when the Asians first started encountering the Europeans, they used to say, "Oh, the Europeans have a strong head but weak gut." The monad is symbolic, believe it or not, the power, the true power, right? People think it's the mind. The true power is in the gut. The gut is a mind too. The gut is your first mind. Without the gut, your other mind cannot exist, right? And when I say cannot exist, you won't be able to apply it. It exists beyond the physical, but you won't be able to apply it in the physical without the gut. So the gut is the first mind. The stomach of a baby and the intestines of a baby develops, the digestive system of the baby develops before the mind. The mind develops at 7. The digestive system might start at 1 or 2, like fully developed. So that's the difference, right? That's a significant difference between each. So, and that's the difference between an African Gnostic and a regular African or indigenous person, right? So let's just take the African out. An indigenous Gnostic versus a regular indigenous spiritual practitioner. The regular indigenous spiritual practitioner will get so hung up on their forces that are native to them, and because their forces, from their perception, they perceived it like it animated first, and realistically, it's not that animated first. It animated first from their point in space, right? From the third dimension. Third dimension. A lot of people, when they die, they go to fourth dimension. So a lot of our world's really third dimension, fourth dimension heavy, right? You want to throw fifth and sixth, you could, right? Dimension 6 through 1 have the same origin point. So you could, if you want to add the fifth and sixth, you could. We have the same origin point. When you from that origin point, you're gonna perceive the imperfect forces as different than the higher forces. That's the difference, right? So from that standpoint, when you look at it, what you have to do is say, okay, that's where you have the different types of Gnostic thoughts, right? And that's where the Gnostics are very different than, I guess you could say, the other spiritual counterparts, right? And from that aspect, that's why the monad is so important, because when you understand the monad, right, and the power of the circle. So let's go to occult thought, right? Why is the circle so powerful? The circle in occult thought, like, you know, if you just want to go to numbers, right, you say 0, let's just say the 0 is the circle, right? So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? And then there's no number after 9. Everything else is a composite number, right? Everything, the denser you get, denser means the further the number is, the further it is away from the circle, right? The further you get away from that, the more imperfection starts, right? So the circle ends up being something that any real occultist has to make nice with. So, for instance, when in the Western circles, when they say the lesser pentagram ritual, banishing ritual, they banish, and they call these 4 angels that surround them, and the 4 angels that surround them are in a circle, because what the key is, the circle and the cross, or the circle and number 4 have a relationship with each other. Of course, the circle and all the numbers have a relationship with each other, because the circle represents the abstract energy that gives birth to the forces that are behind the numbers. But in terms of being able to apply it from our human experience, the number 4 is crucial, right? That's why the cross is symbolic of number 4. That's crucial. So there's a relationship that's there, right? And so when you look at it from that aspect, what then tends to happen is that you then have to understand that the circle, when you draw a circle around yourself, so even when you say you draw a circle around yourself, in the East, they would actually meditate in a circle, right? They will meditate within the circular structure sometimes. And why would they do that? Because it's thought that within that structure, you can tap into forces that you normally can't when you step out the circle. So the reason why it's sort of related to the lesser pentagram ritual is related to when Western occultists say they draw the circle of protection, right? They draw the circle to protect themselves, right? They draw the circle of protection and nothing can enter. Take that aspect and say, okay, forget about even demons entering or even negative spirits entering. When you draw the circle around yourself and you understand what a circle is, it's not just you hear this video and draw a circle around yourself, start meditating, but you understand what a circle is, right? It represents a purity that as long as you stay in that space, when you're meditating, you can tap into forces that normally you couldn't, even mentally. That's why even the tree of life is 10 sephiroths, right? 10 circles. Right? You can tap into forces that you normally can't. So when people talk about the imperfect world and the merge and all these things, once you go outside that circle, you're not going to be able to tap into those forces the same way, right? Because you're surrounded by chaos and imperfection, and that's being nice, right? And this is where the indigenous Gnostic, the African Gnostic, will differ from the European Gnostic. The European Gnostic doesn't care. Because he has the intellect, that's all he cares about, right? So he can talk about the eons, and he could talk about Sophia, and he could talk about all that, and he could talk about Christ, the true King, right? I'm gonna have a total separate video on Yahshua, and that's all he cares about. But the indigenous Gnostic, the African Gnostic, right? From their perception, what ends up happening is they understand that what the European Gnostic is talking about is true in the circle. That's what the monad is, right? It's true in that. And it's true in terms of understanding the forces that you're calling on. Because every force that you're calling on has a hierarchy when you go from 0 down, right? When you go from principles like justice, perfection, harmony, grace. These are all like we saying those words, grace, harmony, justice. Those are spiritual powers. That's far above the imperfect powers that people see, right? Far above it. So they understand when they're going to enter that oh shoot, these are actually legitimate powers that people are dealing with, right? That are far above the elements and the planets. But if you know, but in the physical world, the elements and the planets and the lesser gods from them are just as important because they form like an armor around you. Once you leave the circle. That's why the number 4 deals with organization, right? So when you say number 4 deals with organization, what ends up happening is when you leave the circle, you have to organize the imperfect forces to work for you. That's when indigenous Gnostic and African Gnostic, we differ from the European Gnostic. We understand. If I'm doing the ATR, I'm talking about the Loa and the Orishas and the Mobongos and the Lucy, right? And the Obosoms. Those are personal forces that are far removed from the monad. Once I leave the circle, those forces become related to number 4. They become armor around myself that I use to go into my everyday life, the everyday existence, and be able to take control of it. Then when I go back home, when I go back to my sacred space and I'm praying and I'm meditating, then I'm inside the circle and I tap into the monad, the true power of the monad itself. That's why I said the number 4 and number 0, and 0 is not really a number, but the number 4 has a special relationship in terms of using the power of 0 or the monad in one's everyday life. That's why it's associated with the Christian cross. So there's a lot of stuff that I got to unload when it comes to Gnosticism, but I thought the monad is a very important concept to I feel that to the merge, Sophia, Christ, the eons, they get more love than the monad. There is no Gnosticism without the monad. So Siris King, till next time, peace.